Hi, now we're going to start in what is, groups and organizations. Now, we spend most of our lives in groups, including families, friends, school, and work groups. So it's important to understand the characteristics and dynamics of groups ranging from small and informal to large and bureaucracies. So this chapter is going to provide you with many examples, and you'll find them in your text in the box supplements, which demonstrates the application and relevance of sociology and sociological research and theory to business and modern living. Now, by learning about bureaucracies and how they work, we can better be prepared for when we experience bureaucracies ourselves, both in the present and in the future. Now, you may not think about the organizations and groups that influence your life, despite the many ways in that bureaucracies affect them. New information technologies, social media, are also allowing us to become members of groups and organizations in more subtle, non-physical ways. A deep understanding of organizations will aid all of us in our future choices and decisions, both in school and in the workplace. So let's get started with the beginning about social groups. Now, in social groups, as a social being, we live our lives in groups, and they are constantly affecting our behavior. Social groups are distinct from both aggregates, which are a collection of people who happen to be in the same place at the same time, but they don't really have anything else in common, and with groups known as categories. Now, categories are a collection of individuals who've never met one another, but they share a similar characteristics. Now, when we get into what are social groups, we refer to two or more people who interact frequently, share a sense of belonging, and have feelings of interdependence. Now, interdependence is a need to be with one another and can share ideas and thoughts, and they're not totally independent, don't need anybody else, and they're not totally dependent, must have other people. They're interdependent. So now there are primary groups. These are small, personal groups which members engage in emotional-based interactions over an extended period of time. Now this would be your family, your peer group, friends who you've had for long periods of time as examples of primary group. Now, the alternative group are known as secondary group. Now, these are larger. They're more specialized groups in which members have less personal and they're more formal. They're goal-oriented relationships over a specific period of time. Now, secondary groups, this would be like universities, colleges, corporations. They can be made up of many primary groups within them, but secondary groups are goal-oriented, larger, and often related to our workplace. Now, regardless, all groups set boundaries. These boundaries are to indicate, who does and who does not belong in the in-group. In-groups are groups that we belong to and which we identify with. They provide us with a source of identity. Who are we? And they are a point of reference in terms of how do we judge how we're doing among other people. It's within our in-group that we do that with. Now, if there's an in-group, there's an out-group. The out-group is a group to which a person does not belong or toward which the person may feel a sense of competitiveness, even to the extent of hostility. Essentially, boundaries for in-group and out-group are intended to create belongingness and acceptance. It's a basic psychological need. And the boundaries can promote, as you might imagine, racism, sexism, ageism, and a sense of ethnocentrism. Now, part of when we look at groups, we also must consider reference groups. Now, a reference group is a group that strongly influences a person's behavior and social attitudes regardless of whether that individual is actually a member. So, for example, if you reference how you must appear, based on looking at social media and Instagram influencers, you might be judging yourself inappropriately because that may not be an appropriate reference group to look to. So you look to other people or groups, whether you're a part of that group or not, as a reference to how do you measure your own success, or how do you, consider what you accept and don't accept. So a reference group helps us explain our behavior and our attitudes. Sometimes they differ from those of our membership group, and we may accept the values and the norms of a group with which we identify rather than the one in which we belong. So reference groups become important. If you imagine yourself looking to other people and wanting to emulate them, then you would have to consider that that other person or group of people would be your reference group. And again, I would emphasize that we don't always use the appropriate reference group. If I have an admiration for an athletic team and particular athletes, and I aspire to be like them, but I don't put the time and the effort into it that they do, then having them held out as my reference group will always make me feel like I'm not good enough because I can't achieve what they do. So I need to find other people as my reference group. Now, another term that we'll use in terms of groups are what's called a network. Now, a network is a web of social relationships that link individuals to each other. An understanding of social networks and their human bridges is important on many levels in terms of epidemiologists who study the spread of diseases. The networks that we have can create links by which diseases travel, to individuals looking for employment, to government agencies trying to control terrorist activities, to social scientists studying the impact of gender and ethnicity on social interactions. Now, whether a group's boundaries are formal, with clearly defined criteria for membership, or informal, as in friendships, the size of a group and what is one of its most important features in terms of how group affects us. Now, you may not know this particular researcher from the 50s, Stanley Milgram. Now, he did a study, we're going to reference him later, but he did a study that found that it took an average of 5 contacts to get letters sent to the intended recipient. So it wasn't like he gave this to a person that he knew had a relationship with the person the letter was intended to, but he gave it to one person who needed to find another person who could in turn find another person, that within 5 contacts that letter would get to the correct person. Now, the research was popularized in a movie you may or may not be aware of. It's called 6 Degrees of Separation. And there's a popular trivia game, if you're a Kevin Bacon fan, of 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. But the notion that these social networks, when you think of the kind of research that he did, it was to look at the breadth of our networks that would allow that only 5 contacts would get a letter sent to the correct person. All right, so let's move on. Let's look at characteristics and dynamics of groups. So what purpose do groups serve? Well, according to functionalists, people from groups meet their instrumental or their task-oriented tasks and expressive or emotional needs through groups. Groups help members do jobs that are impossible or difficult to do alone. So it's with groups that we can get tasks completed, whether they be instrumental or emotional. There's certainly going to be boundaries that say, this is our family and that's your family, and we share boundaries, or we keep each other at bay because of our boundaries. Now, conflict theorists, they believe that groups involve in a series of power relationships whereby the needs of individual members may not be equally served. People working together toward a common goal they could not achieve alone, group projects, the inequity can result in poverty and unemployment. Now, that's a very typical response from conflict, to look at things as being the haves versus the have-nots. Symbolic interactionalists focus on group size influences. That is to say, what influence does the group size have on interactions among its members? Does it support one another? Does it create friendships? Symbolic relationships, symbolic interactions would look at the kind of relationships that can be formed out of, for example, in your college class, in your program, you might meet people who remain friends with you for very long after college. And it's that symbolic interactionalism about how you interact and how you associate and support one another and develop these friendships through your face-to-face contact. Postmodernists, they look at relationships are being increasingly becoming more and more superficial. They don't see, they look at the social media and the advent of so much technology and the separation of people from face-to-face contact that it's become less personal and more superficial. So if we continue on with group dynamics, we can look at the small group. Now, a small group is a collectivity small enough for all members to be acquainted with one another and to interact simultaneously. Now, when you look at the two variations of small groups, these are terms you've probably heard of before. A dyad, which is a group consisting of two members, just two, dyad, and triad, a group composing of 3 members. And the size of groups are important. Interactions are more personal and more intense in small groups. For example, in a dyad, a group of 2, the active participation of both members is crucial for that group's survival. Having a conversation with somebody who doesn't respond or give any feedback will end quickly. But that conversation between 2 people where both are actively engaged enriches the relationship, keeps that dynamic continuing. All right? So dyads provide an intense bond and a sense of unity not found in larger groups. Add a third person, the dyad becomes a triad, and coercion as well as coalitions begin to appear. 2 versus 1. And that variation can shift according to the topic that's being discussed. So it adds another flavor that dyads don't. So as a group size increases beyond 3, members tend to specialize in different tasks and communication patterns change. If you've worked in groups where they are 6, 5, 10, you know that it's a little less personal, a little more goal-oriented, and not everybody will do the same thing. So now I want to move into 2 elements, well, one in particular, I guess, that experiments that one of which won't be ever performed again. It was an ethical issue. But we're going to look at group conformity and the notion of how we conform. Now, Solomon Asch and Stanley Milgram, who we mentioned earlier, their work would it's kind of peculiar because they did 2 different things, but they looked at obedience and conformity. And it would demonstrate that in order to maintain ties with the group, members may go to great lengths to conform to group norms. Now, lengths that can be including the harassment of other individuals or outgroup, and groupthink, the process by which a large group arrives at a decision that its members privately believe is unwise. Now, we're going to break down conformity a bit. The process of maintaining or changing behavior to comply with the norms established by a society, a subculture, or other group. Now, the theory here is that we tend to be significantly influenced by others in our group to the extent that we may deny our own senses, our own loyalties, and our own commitment to truth. Most people would say, that won't be me. I am my own person. But you might be surprised in terms of the research how frequently we will compromise what we think we saw in order to belong to a group. And that's an important element in regards to sociology and group, of how important groups are. Our friends are paramount to us. Our family is critical to us, and it may and does influence our ability to conform and our need to conform. Now, the topic of conformity opens the dialogue where there are competing emphases. The connection of conformity and personal awareness of one's own values and beliefs. We encounter many different choice points in our lives, the good and the bad. Being true to one's values and beliefs or conform to those of others. In spite of our ability in spite of our better judgment, we will at times make decisions that are contrary to our beliefs. Now, the other component here, and it's an important feature into sociology, but also psychology, is how frequently, or maybe it's better to say how infrequently, people reflect on what it is that are their core beliefs and values, that they can state them, to know when you're breaching them or when you need to stand firm. The more connected we are to who we are, especially the good in us, the better able we are to make decisions that we can be proud of and we can defend. Being aware and connected to our values and beliefs enables us to stand alone when we must. Now, there's a saying, an old saying, I'm sorry I haven't got the source of the saying, but you may have heard this before. There's a fight between good and evil in every person, and the question might be, well, who wins? The one you feed the most. So things like integrity, trust, respect, love, acceptance, loyalty, the more we feed these, the more they become, in fact, who we are, and they may be the basis of our beliefs and values. Okay, so let's look at those two pieces of research. Ausha's research found that participants were willing to contradict their own best judgment if the rest of the group disagreed with them. Now, I'll post the video for Ausha's experiment and Milgram's so you can see for yourself what the experiments were and what the results were. Now, what's going to be interesting about both of these is that Ausha's experiment has been repeated many, many times over the years, and the results remain the same. Milgram's experiment, as you'll see when you watch it, had some ethical issues associated with it, and that particular experiment wouldn't be replicated with the exact same conditions. However, those times when the experiment was done over demographics, age groups, the consistency of the results were remarkably consistent. Now, Milgram's research found that participants were willing to do something. In the case of his experiment, give an electric shock. In the experiment, they didn't really give an electric shock, but they believed they did. And they would do that because they believed the authority figure told them to do it, and they believed them. Now, when the experimenter indicated that the teacher should give increasingly more painful shocks, up to quite lethal ones, 65% of those participants administered shocks all the way up to what was labeled as XXX, 450 volt level. Now, what can we say? What can we learn from the Milgram study? Well, the study provides evidence that obedience to authority may be more common than most of us would like to believe. In part, it's partly, if you will, why in different professions where your role is critical, doctors, nurses, police, lawyers, they have a uniform. And the uniform presents an image of authority, that when they say something, we tend to accept that authority. So these videos will be posted in week 9 along with this video. So let's move on. I referenced briefly groupthink. It's the process by which members of a cohesive group will arrive at a decision many individual members privately believe isn't smart. Now, one of the examples is the tragic 2010 explosion of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, and it resulted in 11 deaths and massive damage to the Gulf coast. Now, part of the groupthink issue here is that some of the decisions that went towards the putting the Deepwater Horizon oil rig and some of the repairs wasn't agreed upon, but everyone did agree. That's the group thing. Now, the other example I have is the Challenger, where it exploded with the teacher on board. The groupthink model there was that it was agreed to let the ship take off and go as scheduled. However, there was some concerns about O-rings, and as it turned out, when the explosion was investigated, what was the issue? The O-rings. Okay, let's move forward. Now we're going to move into formal organizations. Now we've sort of looked at the sort of personal components. We're going to look at formal organizations. Formal organizations are a highly structured secondary group formed to achieve very specific goals in an efficient manner. Now for Max Weber, the most perfect expression of bureaucracy is the bureaucracy. This is a formal organization characterized by a hierarchy of authority. Treat it like a triangle. You have the workers down here, and as the triangle comes to a peak, you have the CEO. So that's a hierarchy of authority, levels of who has what responsibilities and what degree of authority. They also have a clear division of labor, explicit rules, regulations, and qualifications based on employment, and it's relatively to very impersonality in terms of personal matters. Unfortunately for Weber, bureaucracies are more than an organization. They are people. People fuel informal structures, activities, and bypass and even ignore the formal channels, i.e. the information grapevine. You might have seen that in your own workplace. So let's look at these characteristics a bit closer. Now I mentioned the bureaucracy by Weber's standard, division of labor. Each member has a specific status with certain assigned tasks to fulfill. Requires the employment of specialized experts who are responsible for the effective performance of their duties. Colleges have admin and support and faculty, and each has a role and responsibility to deliver for a successful semester. Hierarchy of authority, a chain of command that is based on each lower office being under the control and supervision of a higher one. The rules and regulations are standardized rules and regulations that establish authority within an organization and usually are provided to members within written format, your job description, code of conduct, policies and principles. Qualifications based on employment, well, hiring of staff members and professional employees is based on specific qualifications. Your individual performance is evaluated against the specific standards, and promotions are based on merit specified out in personal policies. Impersonality, this is where the interactions are based on status and standardized criteria rather than personal feelings or subjective factors. The phrase, "it's just business," epitomizes this particular point. Now, there's an informal structure to bureaucracies. Organizations are made up of formal structures, but they're also made up of people. Each bureaucracy has informal structures composed of those aspects of participants' day-to-day activities and interactions that either ignore, bypass, or do not correspond with the official rules and procedures of a bureaucracy. Now, you can treat this as informal structure means your internal culture, the way that things are. Anytime you've worked within a bureaucracy, there are rules and regulations. However, the day-to-day interactions of people might not always abide by that, might even find workarounds, and that's the internal culture. You might be told by your boss, "Come and see me anytime, my door is always open." However, whenever you go, "Oh, sorry, I don't have time, I've got a meeting, got to run." So the rules say, "Here and available for you." The internal culture is not always. Now Hawthorne, he did research and his studies that made social scientists aware of the effect of informal networks on workers' productivity. The study of the electric company found that workers created their own rules in spite of the management's directions. They helped others, they played cards, and they swapped jobs. Now the negative to this is that people are lazy and don't want to do work. They have a negative impact on the employer who are excluding from them. The positive is they encourage cooperation among people to better meet the company's goals. The human relationship approach. Okay, let's touch on some of the shortcomings of bureaucracies. You got to imagine, as much as there are some positives, there must be some degree of shortcomings. Inefficient and rigidity. self-protective behavior of the upper level and information blockage heading to the monopolization of information by upper levels can result in workers and management working at cross purposes. There is a tendency that when times get tough in corporations, that they all hang on to their own piece of the pie so as to be seen as indispensable, and in doing so creates barriers from success in achieving goals. Goal displacement is another shortcoming, the process that occurs in organizations when the rules become an end in themselves rather than the means to an end, and organizational survival becomes more important than the achievement of goals. Bureaucratic personality is another shortcoming, a psychological construct that describes that those workers who are more concerned with following correct procedure than they are with doing the job correctly. Resistance to change. In my experience as being a corporate trainer, resistance to change is oftentimes a part of every transition. The resistance can make it difficult for organizations to adopt new circumstances. Now, partly due to the distance between management and workers resulting in a limited communication platform, many companies fail because of this inability to change. Another shortcoming is the perpetuation of gender, race, and class inequities. Middle and upper class employers are more likely to have careers characterized by high wages, job security, and opportunities for advancement, whereas the poor and working class employee, who are more likely to be women and members of racial minorities, are more likely to work in occupations characterized by low wages, lack of job security, and few opportunities for promotion. Now, in updating Weber's work on bureaucracies, McDonaldization became a point of exploration by George Ritzer. Updating Weber's work, which was based on the view that rationalization was inevitable a part of social world, sociologist George Ritzer looked at what he calls McDonaldization, the process by which the principles of the fast food industry, efficiency, predictability, control, for example, have been transferred to a performance model of other sectors of society. So let's look at this. Efficiency. It's like an assembly line. Calculability, the emphasis on speed and quality and quantity rather than quality. Predictability, a standard menu and a scripted encounters. Make every place you go the same. Control. Individual workers have little to no say in the operation of business. Do your part and do it well. Irrationalities of rationalities. Irrationalities of rationalities. The dehumanizing of for both the consumer and the worker. It becomes just a product. Rationality. The process by which traditional methods of social organizations characterized by informality, spontaneity, are gradually replaced by these formal rules and procedures of a bureaucracy. So, where might groups and organizations be in the future? Well, networks have an advantage over other organized forms because they are agile and can quickly adapt to new circumstances. Now, while we can never be certain about the future, broad social trends such as globalization, technological innovations, and prevalence of social economy will continue. Now, for example, production of open source software such as Linux operating systems and Firefox internet browser, these products are created by a network of people who are working together with no expectation of profit. Now, there are some special cases like Al-Qaeda's terrorists and ISIS. How illicit drugs get from cocoa fields in Colombia and the poppy fields of Afghanistan to the streets of our cities. That's through networks. Their flexibility, however, comes at the expense of well-specialized lines of communication and means of coordinating, both of which can be addressed by modern communication technology. Now, while network structures can be corporations to become more profitable, the impact upon workers may not be so positive. It's likely that the future work lives of today's students, you, will be affected by, in many ways, by some positive but other negatives by the shift of this networked organization. This may make it likely that networks will be dominant organizations in the future. They're more agile and adaptive than other forms of networks and are able to adjust more quickly to these new circumstances. Now, out of this comes what's known as network enterprises, businesses which may be companies or parts of companies joined together for specific projects that become the focus of the network. Some of the elements of this is they're highly flexible. One can select and change network partners based on cost, efficiency, technology innovation. Examples of some network enterprises would be Ford and Toyota, Dell Computer. Now, keys for success in global internet is key. In addition to technology, culture and organization means are necessary, like an entrepreneurial culture, a democratic government, presence of well-educated workforce. Some of the problems with network enterprises: the loss of power of the union, offshoring of jobs, and potential for alienation. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Look at groups and organizations. Carry on the good fight, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.